For generations, outsiders doubted their story, until the science finally confirmed what the Maroons had always known about their own blood. In the mountains of Jamaica, a community held a story about who they were and where they came from. They were the Maroons, descendants of enslaved Africans who refused to remain in bondage. They escaped into the island's most punishing terrain and built something no colonial power had planned for: free communities that endured. For centuries, their oral history carried claims about their ancestry, about African roots, and about an indigenous connection to the island itself. And for centuries, outsiders questioned it. Oral tradition, the doubters said, was not proof. But how do you prove where a people truly come from, when the records that mattered were kept by the very system they fought to escape? That question would wait nearly 300 years for an answer. And the answer would come not from a document, but from the cells of the living descendants themselves. To understand what the DNA finally revealed, we first have to understand how these communities were forged in the first place. In war, in mountains, and in a specific corner of West Africa. Part 1. Into the Cockpits and the Blue Mountains. The Maroons split into two major groups, each shaped by the land it chose. In the west, the Leeward Maroons gathered under a leader named Cudjoe, known also as Kojo, in the region called the Cockpit country. In the east, the Windward Maroons formed under leaders, including the celebrated Nanny, in the Blue Mountains. These were not random hiding places. The Cockpit country is a landscape of steep-sided depressions and conical hills, a jagged karst maze that swallows pursuers and rewards those who know its hidden paths. The Leeward Maroons turned this terrain into a natural fortress, using the depressions and ridges as defensive walls that no marching column could easily breach. In the east, the Blue Mountains offered the same brutal advantage: height, cover, and isolation. But choosing the right ground was only half of it. To survive against the most powerful empire of the age, the Maroons needed a way of fighting that turned their small numbers into an unstoppable force. And here, a sound echoing through the hills would become their signature weapon.
Part 2. The war Britain could not win.
That sound was the abeng, a cow-horn trumpet. Maroon scouts used it to send messages across the valleys and ridges, coordinating movements that colonial forces could neither hear clearly nor understand. British troops were trained for open battlefields, for lines and volleys. What they met instead was guerrilla warfare, ambushes from the ridgelines, attackers who melted back into the forest, an enemy who knew every fold of the terrain. These tactics proved highly effective against conventional British forces, but the war was not without heavy cost. During the First Maroon War in 1732, the British managed to occupy Nanny town when the Windward Maroons withdrew deeper into the Blue Mountains. It was a moment that could have looked like defeat. Instead, the withdrawal was survival, a strategic retreat into terrain even harder to reach. The Maroons did not need to win every position. They needed to make the war unwinnable for Britain. And slowly, that is exactly what happened. The empire that had never negotiated with escaped slaves was about to do something almost unthinkable: sit across a table and sign.
Part 3. The Treaties of 1739.
In 1739, the impossible was put on paper. The British signed treaties that gave legal recognition to the Maroon groups. Captain Cudjoe, the leader of Trelawney Town, secured the peace agreement that ended years of costly conflict. The terms were extraordinary for their time. The treaties granted freedom. They granted the Leeward Maroons land. And they granted rights that exceeded those of other free black people on the island. A people who had begun as escapees from enslavement had forced a colonial superpower to acknowledge them as a self-governing community. This was more than a ceasefire. It was recognition of autonomy, wrung out of Britain by war. But treaties settle borders and rights. They do not answer the deeper question of identity. Who were these people really? Their culture pointed in a very specific direction, toward one particular stretch of the West African coast. And that cultural signature would later become a hypothesis the scientists could test. Part 4. The Kromanti Signature. Long before genetics, the Maroons carried their origins in their ceremonies. At the center stood the Kromanti dance, a Maroon religious ceremony rooted in African practice, especially the traditions of the Asante of Ghana. Even the name carries the map. Kromanti derives from Coromantee, a slave fort area on the Ghanaian coast. That coast was the Gold Coast, and the people brought from it were labeled Coromantee. They were drawn from several Akan groups, and many carried a militaristic background, a martial culture that historians link directly to slave rebellions across the Americas. Suddenly, the Maroon story fits together. A militaristic people from the Gold Coast, transported into slavery, escaping into the mountains and waging a war so effective, it forced treaties. The culture was not a vague memory of Africa. It was specific. Akan, Asante, Gold Coast. The oral tradition and the ceremonies pointed to a precise homeland. But could biology confirm what the drums and the dances had preserved? That was the question a group of researchers set out to answer with DNA. Part 5. What the DNA revealed. The genetic studies of the Akan Town Maroons produced a striking picture. In the maternal line, the mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child. L-type sub-Saharan African haplogroups appeared in 96% of samples. The African origin was not just dominant, it was overwhelming. A broader interdisciplinary study of Jamaican profiles found the same pattern, with roughly 97.5% falling into L sub-Saharan haplogroups. One specific profile, called L2A1, was found 9 times in Jamaica, more than in any other African or American region tested, pointing to discrete episodes of genetic drift as small founding populations grew in isolation on the island. But the study was also testing a long-debated claim from Maroon oral history, an indigenous American connection. And here the DNA did not erase the story, it confirmed a piece of it. The remaining 4% of the maternal samples belonged to haplogroup B2, an indigenous American lineage, small but real. The maternal ancestry was predominantly African, yet it included that indigenous American component, complementing, not contradicting, the Maroon oral history that outsiders had doubted. The picture grew richer still. Autosomal data showed the dominance of African ancestry alongside additional admixture, around 13% European and about 9% East Asian in the Akan sample. And on the paternal side, the presence of Hai's haplogroup R1b2V88 suggested some African ancestry tracing toward northern Cameroon, northern Nigeria, Chad, or Niger. The Maroons were overwhelmingly African, rooted heavily toward the Gold Coast world their culture had always named, and yet their genome also held that small, verified indigenous signal they had insisted upon all along. Part 6. When the blood confirms the story. There is something profound in what the science did here. It did not hand the Maroons a new identity. It confirmed the one they had carried for centuries, through the Kromanti dance, through the sound of the abeng, through the names and the ceremonies preserved in the mountains. The overwhelming African ancestry matched the Coromantee origin embedded in their culture, and the small indigenous maternal signal validated an oral tradition that outsiders had dismissed as unproven. For a people whose history was told in whispers and ceremonies rather than in the archives of empire, the DNA became a form of vindication. The doubt that had shadowed their story for generations met evidence written in the body itself. The Akan Maroons descended from enslaved Africans who fought a war, won recognition, and built a lasting community in western Jamaica. And now the genetics stand alongside the drums as testimony. Memory and biology told the same story. The Maroons had never needed the confirmation to know who they were. But when it came, it closed a long argument in their favor. Proof that a people can hold their truth across centuries and be right. This story touches on the trauma of enslavement and survival. If its themes weigh heavily on you, please reach out to a trusted local support service or mental health helpline in your area. Help is available, and you don't have to carry it alone.